So Superior Iron Man is like one of the best stories ever. And it's hilarious because like you guys have been screaming at me to do Superior Iron Man. Like, Rob, we need the Superior Iron Mans. And it's pretty funny to me. It's pretty interesting because it really is just a great story. Now, here's the deal. Superior Iron Man comes out of two things. The first thing is the second wave of Marvel Now, and the other one is Axis. Now, we haven't done Axis yet, and really the only motivation for me to do Axis was to lead into Superior Iron Man. So I'll leave it on you guys. I mean, Axis is a pretty cool story. It's interesting up to a point, but with Axis, it basically dealt with the aftermath of Avengers versus X-Men. Remember, in Avengers versus X-Men, we basically ended up seeing Cyclops as really in possession of part of the Phoenix Force, killing Charles Xavier. Now, what this did is it basically sent Professor X in sort of this no man's land, in the sense that what ended up happening is that Red Skull basically took the brain of Charles Xavier and then rechristened himself as Onslaught. He basically had Charles Xavier's abilities. Of course, there were other things going on, like creating concentration camps, things like that, but the idea was that in order for Red Skull to be defeated, there was actually a spell that was cast by Doctor Strange and Scarlet Witch. And what this did is it basically inverted people's moral compasses. So good guys became bad guys became good guys. In the instance of Tony Stark, his comic book character basically became Tony Stark from the Marvel Cinematic Universe. That's essentially what happened. Now, the funny thing about this is that when the spell was reversed, again, basically meaning that people will return back to the way that they were supposed to be, Iron Man shielded himself. And so the result was that when everybody went back to normal, Tony Stark stayed being a jerk. Now, the reason why Marvel did this is because at the end of the run of Iron Man that we had just finished, so the whole thing with like God Killer armor and Arno Stark, the secret brother of Tony Stark, different things like that, Marvel had about 12 months between the end of that story, the end of that run, and the start of All New, All Different Marvel. And the idea was that with Secret Wars coming, Marvel was basically winding down stories. That's why you saw things like the last days of different characters, the last days of Asgard, the last days of like the Punisher, different things like that. And so what Marvel did is instead of just crafting this, grandiose story with Tony Stark and last days, different things like that, instead Tom Taylor was brought on board and just gave us like this short run of Iron Man where he was basically just a jerk, and it's amazing. So so with all that exposition out of the way, again, what this does is it actually picks up with San Francisco. Now, this really just kind of follows Tony Stark moving from New York to San Francisco proper, and he actually takes up residence at Alcatraz. But it initially picks up with She-Hulk facing against some villain named Teen Abomination, which is kind of a weird scenario. But of course, when Iron Man's head gets knocked off, people start to panic, only for us to find out that it's not actually Tony Stark himself. Instead, it's one of his autonomous suits. What we end up finding out is that he's partying with like a bunch of super hot chicks back at his place. Now, of course, this leads into Pepper Potts. Now, one of the things that I want to talk about here for a second, and we'll cover this a little bit more as we get into the next video, is something called Stark Resilient. But Stark Resilient was the Matt Fraction run of Iron Man, and we actually hadn't covered that. That was the run of Iron Man that took place before the one that we just did. And in truth, it's really like the aftermath to Civil War. So it's basically Tony Stark as director of S.H.I.E.L.D. Now, the idea here is that with Stark Resilient, it was basically Iron Man trying to quote unquote turn over a new leaf. It was Tony Stark back then basically saying, okay, I don't necessarily want to be the weapons manufacturer. What I want to do is I want to start creating products that can just make life better for the world. So when it comes to like the Marvel Cinematic Universe Iron Man, when it got to the point in the first film when he basically created the Iron Man armor, the actual real Iron Man armor, and then told Obadiah Stane he wanted to drop weapons manufacturing, that's basically that element of Matt Fraction's run rolled over into the movie. At least I'm pretty sure Matt Fraction's run happened before then, but Stark Resilient was a new name of that company. So it focused on new forms of technology, different things like that, phone development, so on and so forth, and all that served the purpose of just making the world a better place. The issue was that Tony Stark, realizing that Pepper was a person who would always be in danger at his side, moved her away from Stark Industries and put her in Stark Resilient. And so they basically run two different companies. Now, the idea here is that with Pepper Potts basically running up on him, what we're introduced to is the new Iron Man armor, the Endosim armor. Now, this is probably one of the coolest suits ever. Like it's one of the coolest Iron Man armors ever. Not only does it just look amazing, but it's an armor that actually responds to the psychic control of Tony Stark. Now, again, that's not new. Extremis, the Extremis suit, did the exact same thing. But the whole idea here is that this is modeled and predicated on the Venom symbiote. Now, the Venom symbiote is basically this symbiote that is sentient. It does think for itself, that works alongside the host. The idea here is that with this suit, Tony Stark as Iron Man can basically modify it in a litany of different ways. It basically serves the purpose of being an extension of himself. And so it just looks really awesome. Now, there are some perks to it that we haven't really seen before, and we'll actually see those as this video progresses. But again, this is really him just being a dick. What he had basically done is he had used this Extremis 3.0 app in order to give everybody in San Francisco the ability to be beautiful. Now, this is where we start coming out of the whole Arno Stark storyline. And that's the biggest issue with Superior Iron Man, is at the end of our last run, when we had talked about the rings of the Mandarin, different things like that, Arno Stark, the brother of Tony, had basically taken the Extremis technology and then modified it to essentially become something that could be used to like heal people. It was basically this like humanitarian technology. What Tony did is he took that Extremis tech from Arno and then he in turn modified it just for selfish means. And what he did is he distributed this app among the entire population of San Francisco, granting them what they perceived to be the perfect life, meaning they were all beautiful people. The problem with this is that the app only has a trial period, and when the trial period ends, they go back to looking like their normal selves. Well, this progresses exactly as we would think it would, in the sense that people just start freaking out, because for them, now it's like an addiction. Not only that, you have those who see themselves as beautiful and those who don't have the app. They don't have, a phone to tap into it or whatever the case may be, but it's not activated for them. And so the result is that it's basically creating this social clash, this social war among the various classes that exist. Now, of course, this also brings into the equation Daredevil. Now, historically speaking, Daredevil has almost always operated out of New York, but when writer Mark Waid took over with Daredevil Volume 3, with issue number 36 or 38, I believe, what he did is, as part of the second rollout, the second phase of the original Marvel Now event, he basically moved Matt Murdock to San Francisco. And that basically saw the dissolution of Nelson and Murdock as a lawyer team. And so it essentially just kind of sent Matt Murdock back along his own way. But the idea was that with Mark Waid, it was changing things up. Now, again, Pepper Potts really kind of panics here. And that's the cool thing, because remember, in the Iron Man landscape, Pepper Potts is consistently the voice of reason. She's like the responsible parent, and Tony Stark's just the irresponsible teenager. And so with this app grace period ending, Iron Man is charging people $99 a day in order to be able to continue using this app. It's absolutely crazy. It's like an Apple product. So because of this, what we end up finding out is that somewhere along the line, the mind of Tony Stark was backed up in a digital form. What we actually end up doing here is taking this segment where we wind all the way back to like 1972 with Iron Man number 53, and I want to say all the way up to 1975 with Iron Man issue number 72. I'm not going to swear to that, but there was a villain that was named Black Llama. And of course, we'll talk a little bit more about this, but he was a guy that was created by a dude named Matt Friedrich. Essentially what had happened is that the mind of Tony Stark, at least when Tony Stark had been defeated, because he was almost guaranteed death and escaped by the skin of his teeth, his mind was backed up. And so the result is that this is basically Pepper Potts talking to a earlier version of Iron Man. Now, of course, at the moment, we didn't know this. All we knew is that it was somebody donning the Iron Man suit. But because of the actions of Tony Stark in swindling the people of San Francisco, this leads into a direct conflict between himself and Daredevil. Because of the fact that, Tony Stark is really just kind of turning a darker approach here, the idea is to basically start weeding out people that might try to defy him. And so what he does is he actually gathers the entire city of San Francisco, which is just an insane number of people, and actually says, hey, look, show up at this location at such and such, and you'll all get like a free sample of the whole Extremis tech. Now, of course, this leads into a direct conflict with a guy, but of course, this again highlights another instance of what the armor's capable of, in the sense that it can basically turn itself translucent. It can make it appear as though he's not covering his face, which he actually is. But this also shows us the darker lengths of Tony Stark. Remember, Tony Stark had always been a guy who was teetering on the edge, and for years and years and years and years, alcoholism was always a major part of his character. It was always this thing where it was like, if anything was going to bring the Empire of Stark crashing down, it would be his addiction to alcohol. Now, of course, this really seemed to culminate in the Demon in a Bottle storyline. Fun fact, it wasn't until the final issue of the story that it was actually called Demon in a Bottle, where his alcoholism almost did cost him his entire company, but coming back from it all, it basically resulted in him kind of moving forward and trying to be a good guy. And so for the most part, while I wouldn't say he was like a humanitarian, he was certainly falling more in line with what a traditional hero should be, as opposed to the way he was before, which was more geared towards capitalism. And so because of this is a stark contrast, no pun intended, with how he used to be, in the sense that now he basically tells this guy, look, your son literally ran up on a chick and tried to rob her, and so I can make this go away. The only thing you need to do is go down there and tell people that you agree with my ideas, my motivations, and Extremis tech. Now, on the surface, it doesn't seem like a huge thing, but it is, because this is basically a superhero blackmailing a small-time guy just for the purpose of trying to make sure that the world believes that what he's doing is actually right. And that's why it's so nefarious. In the aftermath of this, and with Daredevil watching all of it unfold, it leads to him kidnapping Tony Stark. Now, of course, this is really Daredevil just trying to interrogate him. As soon as Stark wakes up, he immediately recalls his Indocim armor to himself, and then in turn tells Daredevil, I'm giving you a gift. And this is one of the most mind-blowing moments of the story, because when Matt Murdock wakes up, what he ends up finding is that he can see. He has his eyesight back. Now, this was a huge moment in the story, and it's really one of the biggest moments for Matt Murdock's character. And the reason for this is because his lack of eyesight has been the defining attribute of who he is as a person. In the comics, it was always a cornerstone of every writer who ever focused on Daredevil, how he deals with the world around him while simultaneously trying to be a blind superhero. And in fact, there were years and years and years and years when no one knew he was blind. And even now in the Marvel Universe, at the time this story was written, a large bulk of it don't know that he's blind. And so in this instance, with his blindness being one of the most defining attributes of his character, considering it's been part of his life since he was a child, it's been how he's learned to cope with the world, to suddenly have his eyesight back is this temporary gift. Now again, he's told by Tony Stark, you're not going to have it forever. It's a temporary thing. It's a very short thing, but I want you to experience this. I want you to see what the world is like, and then ask yourself, are you really willing to give that up? Now, the other half of this is it really shows us how far gone Tony Stark has come when he basically says, look, that whole thing with Axis, the whole thing with the Red Skull, so on and so forth, that showed me who I truly am, that I've basically been dumbing myself down in order to make all of you out there feel like you're intelligent. Instead, why should I do that? And so he's run drunk on his own power, his own abilities, his own intelligence, so on and so forth. And so again, this is a pretty dark fall for his character, because what this does is it leads into this quote unquote return of Teen Abomination. Teen Abomination basically breaks out of S.H.I.E.L.D. custody, and then when Iron Man shows up, he just kind of whisks him away and says, look, I will take you under my wing. I'll basically try to help you as best I can. Now, this comes out of the fact with this revelation that Teen Abomination is actually just a 13-year-old kid. That's really all it is. He was just blasted with gamma radiation somewhere along the line, and that was really about it. But with Matt Murdock's character, again, this is one of the saddest moments, because switching back to him, he goes and he sees Foggy Nelson because he just wants to see what he looks like with his own eyes. If only ever one time, if only ever for a brief moment, for a few seconds, he wants to see what he looks like. Of course, his eyesight fades away. He ends up going back to seeing the things the way he normally does. But this is a huge situation for Matt Murdock, because it's this very tempting thing. Okay, I give in. Like I'll take my eyesight. I'll fall in line with the whole, Stark ideology. I'll do whatever it takes in order to make sure that I can continue seeing. Literally sacrifice his role as a superhero in order to go back to being able to see again. And so continuing on with Tony Stark, this is when we start to get into this really nefarious aspect of his character and what's really going on with the Extremis tech. In this instance, it's basically this idea that he has now implemented these cameras, so to speak, the iron drones, whatever it is that he calls them, that are basically parading around the city of San Francisco. And because of this, what they're doing is they're watching everything everyone does all the time, basically declaring the place to be a crime-free zone. And so it's really Tony Stark setting himself up to be a dictator, becoming a villain. He's really just becoming a bad guy. And so in this moment, when Matt Murdock basically makes his return on Tony Stark and essentially says, I'm not willing to take in my ability to see in order to fall in line with what it is that you do. I'm not okay with that. In return, Stark basically takes him prisoner and then wipes his mind, basically just takes away Matt Murdock's knowledge of everything that's happened over the course of the last day. So again, this is a huge moment. These are the kind of things that Tony Stark's doing now, wiping people's minds, spying on people all the time. It's very dictatorial. It's very bad guy. And so again, it's interesting to see it happen because it's just such a change, but God, man, he is a total jerk. He is a total bad guy. And so from here, what we end up doing is we actually pick up with a woman named Katrina. And this falls in with the whole origin to a degree of Teen Abomination, but it also falls in with the idea that Tony Stark has always had this under the surface. It's just now showing itself. In this instance, Katrina was basically in a relationship with Happy Hogan, essentially the assistant of Tony Stark. But in this scenario, there was a process that was being undertaken that involved gamma radiation, but the shielding for the lab was not what it needed to be. And so what they ended up doing was basically seeking out Tony Stark and saying, we need more money to improve this. And Tony Stark's response was no. It was basically, you're not going to get what you need, that money can be spent better elsewhere. And so when the whole experiment ended up taking place and it all went awry, things played out exactly like we thought it would. It resulted in Katrina being blasted with gamma radiation, her son being blasted with gamma radiation, which explains how Teen Abomination got his powers. But then it starts to fill things up a little bit more when we end up learning that in this instance, with everything kind of going under, with the whole project basically being scuttled by Stark Industries and Katrina being put out of work, that in the moment when, her son asks for something that he can't get, he lashes out, he freaks out, and he in turn turns into Teen Abomination, destroys the house, and kills his mom. And so because of this, Tony Stark is effectively responsible for the creation of Teen Abomination and the death of Teen Abomination's mom. This also explains the whole backstory when it comes to Tony Stark's mind being backed up. And it's basically him talking about fighting a villain named Black Llama. But the idea was that when it runs over the whole event of him basically facing off against Black Llama and then ultimately having to back up his mind in the process, what we end up learning is that he essentially forgot everything that had happened. His mind had been wiped from the time that he arrived back home until whatever it is that happened the next day. And so what ends up happening is when he basically sends Teen Abomination off, when he says, yeah, sure, we'll get things sorted out, we'll get you returning back to normal, what he begins doing is asking the question, who wiped a day out of my mind? Who made me forget what it was that happened over the course of that day? And so that's where the second half of the story picks up. Who was it that screwed over Tony Stark? Who is it that wiped that day during his mind? And what was it that happened during this day? And of course, how did things end up progressing over the course of Superior Iron Man? Okay, so getting into Superior Iron Man, really into the conclusion of this story, I told you guys previously, this is pretty short. Superior Iron Man is a very short story, but it's also really cool because this is really just kind of like place filler leading into Secret Wars. But the idea, for those of you guys who have not seen the first video, which you'll find the Iron Man playlist down in the description, but the whole idea behind the first video was that this basically served the purpose of giving us this really dark and sarcastic and really kind of sadistic version of Tony Stark after the events of Axis. Of course, Axis being the event where it basically saw the personalities of a lot of Earth superheroes being inverted, meaning good guys became bad guys became good guys. Now, where the spell was eventually reversed, Tony Stark shielded himself from the spell. He's basically a bad guy now. And as it unfolds, it's actually not going to be one of these things where it's like, well, he's kind of a bad guy depending on how you look at it. He's actually going to be a bad guy. And again, the way this really starts out is with the idea of him meeting up with the federal government. Now, remember, when it came to Superior Iron Man in the first video, we had talked about how he had basically launched Extremis 3.0, which is to say the third iteration of this Extremis tech that could be used to biologically alter people. Now, he had done this for the purpose of making everybody in San Francisco beautiful and then charging them $100 a day in order to basically stay that way. But the idea is that he's shooting for much bigger here. And again, that fits in line with Tony Stark, and we'll talk about that here in a minute. But of course, what he ends up doing is selling something to the federal government, which is worth about $200 million. But of course, he also tells the US military he has an offer for China and for Russia as well, presumably for the same thing. Now, we're not told explicitly what it is that he's selling, but whatever it is that he sells, it's worth $200 million. Now, what he sells is not relevant. What is relevant is the fact that he's got $200 million bucks, and the question is being asked, what's he gonna do with it? Now, of course, this question is being asked by Pepper Potts as well as classic Iron Man. And that's the other half of the equation. Because of the fact that Tony Stark had basically become a villain of sorts, what we ended up finding out is there was an instance whereby he fought a villain called Black Llama. And because of the fact that the battle almost cost him his life, on the off chance that he ended up being killed, Tony Stark actually backed up his own mind with his memories, experiences, the whole 9 yards, so that if he were to die, that backup could be used, presumably thrown into a cloned body or something along those lines, and he in turn would be able to continue on his normal life. And so because of this backed up version, this classic Iron Man, is basically his original self. It's the way he was before the events of Axis ended up taking place. Now, of course, what this does is it makes things kind of strange here, because what we'll actually find out is that because they're basically the same person, that this classic Iron Man is actually going to have some pretty nefarious motives. But what we also end up learning is that with this $200 million, the goal of Tony Stark is to actually travel to one of the biggest media mongols in the world, buy them out, and then use them for his own purposes. Now, with this instance, it's all done for the purpose of him basically forcing these guys' hands. Now, this is a publicly traded company, and what that means is that he's actually able to go through and just take it over with a hostile takeover, buy a massive amount of shares. But in order to basically force their hand, what he actually ends up doing is leaking to the press the idea that he wants to buy this news outlet. Now, it puts these guys in a rock and a hard place. And the reason why is because while this guy is the CEO, and while he is basically the guy that helped to build the company, he's beholden to the shareholders. His company is only as valuable as its stock value. And so if the stock price begins to fall, then suddenly his company will become virtually worthless. But because of this, Tony Stark uses that to his advantage advantage to basically say, people are going to start pulling out if you don't give them answers. So either you can accept my offer or you can turn down my offer, but my offer is going to go through one way or another. Now, of course, what we end up finding out here is this company is not going to sell out to Iron Man. And the reason why is because they already have a buyer. And that buyer is in the form of Pepper Potts. Now, in the last video, we had talked about how Pepper Potts' massive amount of wealth that she has at her disposal comes by way of Resilient. Resilient was basically this company that was formed by Tony Stark, in which Pepper Potts was put in charge of just because of the fact that with her close proximity to Tony Stark, to Iron Man as part of Stark Industries, it constantly made her a target for the various villains that he was facing. And so the idea of Iron Man was to basically form this company called Stark Resilient that would serve the purpose of creating all these different products for making people's lives better, phone products and different things like that. And then in turn, Pepper Potts would be put in charge of that company. That way, anybody coming after Iron Man would have no reason to believe that she was attached to his company. And so because of that, she has this massive corporate wealth behind her. And of course, she ends up buying out this major media outlet because she had really just kind of guessed that's most likely what he was going to do. But what this also does is this brings classic Tony Stark and superior Tony Stark face to face. And so what ends up happening is this suit, of course, takes off. It ends up battling superior Iron Man for a little bit, but then almost immediately takes him prisoner. And what ends up happening here is this suit of armor reveals its own purpose. This classic Iron Man, or this classic Tony Stark, basically says that superior Iron Man is a bad guy. The world is better off without him. And so what this classic Iron Man intends to do against the wishes of Pepper Potts is to actually wipe the mind of superior Iron Man and put his own mind in its place. Again, basically achieving this ulterior motive for its creation in the first place, albeit against the wishes of superior Tony Stark. And so once they actually enter the mindscape, it's really kind of cool, because what this does is it gives us this perspective of how superior Iron Man actually sees himself. I mean, as we would expect with Tony Stark, he's all about himself. When they go into the mindscape of superior Iron Man, it's exactly what we think it is. It's just super hot chicks, parties all the time, everybody thinks he's the most important person ever, and people idolize him. That's really about it. But what classic Iron Man does not know is that superior Iron Man's actually using his armor, using his endosim tech to actually infiltrate the classic Iron Man suit. Now remember, this would be like if you faced off against a version of yourself from 10 years ago. The version of yourself from 10 years ago does not have all the experience that you gained over the last 10 years. And so because of this, the immediate goal is to seize control of superior Iron Man and then in turn just kind of move forward from there. Now, of course, what this also ends up doing is it leads to superior Iron Man, of course, destroying this armor by virtue of using his own endosim suit. The problem with this is it's like the Terminator series and trying to destroy Skynet. Skynet was everywhere. It's like trying to stop the internet. The internet's all over the place. Because of that, this digital backup cannot be destroyed through conventional means, which is to say it's not housed in a suit. Instead, as long as this suit's destroyed, another one will come for superior Iron Man. It'll always work that way because it's a digital backup. And so the idea of superior Iron Man, of Tony Stark, is to basically figure out where this AI is being stored and then destroy its location, deleting the artificial intelligence. The problem with this is that trying to locate Tony Stark becomes infinitely more difficult. And the reason for this is because of the fact that he actually takes refuge back in San Francisco and literally just starts this massive party. Now, this is important because if this were superior Iron Man going for somebody else, it would just be collateral damage and he wouldn't care. That's how his personality is now. That's how it's been inverted. But with this classic Iron Man, collateral damage, it's not something to consider. It's better to simply not attack than to attack where innocents are present. What this does is it allows superior Iron Man the chance to basically begin going through all these documents, going through these databases, chasing down information as best he can until he manages to come across where it is that this digital backup is being stored at. Now, of course, with him making this declaration that he knows what's going on, that he knows where everybody is, taunting this classic version of himself to come after him, what it does is it leads to the endosim armor facing off against all the previous suits of Iron Man. And that's cool because what this does is it's designed to highlight just how far Tony Stark has come in the development of his Iron Man suits. Now, the idea here is that with the endosim tech, it was designed to be superior. That's how Iron Man operates, and it just makes logical sense. Each suit is supposed to be better than the last. And so because of this, the idea of Iron Man is to basically use the endosim armor to take out every single one of these suits, which he for the most part successfully does, but not without having to bring out the big guns. Because of the fact that he's facing off against suits like the Hulkbuster armor, stealth suits, different things like that, what he ends up doing is actually utilizing the endosim armor to its fullest capacity. And that was the purpose of it, right? Like the purpose of the endosim armor was to be this all-encompassing suit. It was literally a Swiss Army knife. It could be anything for any given situation. And so because of that, he literally just cuts a swath through every single one of these armors that he has. It's no real contest. He's able to take every single one of these guys out until Pepper Potts emerges in her own Iron Man suit. Now, this gives Tony Stark pause to stop. And the reason for this is because on the surface, it actually looks like he still cares about Pepper Potts. He basically says, look, okay, I'm not going to attack you. Now, of course, where he refuses to stand down, Pepper ends up using a sonic device on his suit. Now, the reason why this seems to work is because the Endosim armor is designed and modeled after the symbiote suit, which is to say Venom, Carnage. With the Venom and Carnage symbiotes, sound is one of the biggest weaknesses they have, as well as fire. I do not believe fire is a weakness for Carnage, but I believe it is for, I know it is for Venom. But regardless, because it's based on symbiote tech, it just made logical sense with Pepper Potts knowing about the history of Iron Man, being well aware about all the villains that exist out there, to basically use whatever ability she can to her own advantage to take out the suit. Now, of course, this knocks Tony Stark out, brings him back to Stark resilient, that kind of a thing. But because of the fact that he had figured out where the database for these Iron Man suits are at, where this digital backup was located, what he did is actually instill a virus inside Stark Resilient. And what this does is it literally sources out and it goes through every single thread of code. It goes through every database, every hard drive, the whole 9 yards, and it seeks out every little bit of this digital backup of himself that exists out there and deletes them all. And so because of this, once it's done and once it's pulled off, he literally just says, and we're finished here. Of course, he dons a superior Iron Man suit and walks away, but not before throwing a cherry on top. What he basically does is where Pepper Potts believes he can still be redeemed, what he says is, no, I tricked you. I led you to believe that you could defeat me. When Pepper Potts makes the case of saying, hey, I stripped you of your armor once before, I could strip you again, he basically says, look, do you really believe that I would have made a suit that had a weakness to loud noises? All I would have to do is fly through a construction site and suddenly I lose everything. Suddenly the suit comes crashing down or something along those lines. And so what he basically reveals here is that Pepper Potts is not someone he cares about. Pepper Potts is a means to an end. Now, this is huge because historically speaking, when it came to Pepper, while there was some sort of a, strained romantic relationship between the two of them, where were always those instances where Tony Stark basically indicated he wanted to get with Pepper, they never really did. And so because of that, Pepper feels a huge betrayal because despite all that, they were still extremely close friends. Pepper was like the one person in the world that Iron Man trusts, and she trusted him more than anybody else. And so because of that, for him to basically say, no, you're a means to an end, you're just a way for me to basically achieve my goal, it destroys everything that she believes about herself. It destroys the idea that she felt like she was actually a friend to him. So what this does is it basically picks up, of course, with Tony Stark at Stark headquarters, and then it segues itself into Secret Wars. Now, the problem with this is the continuity of the story. We could argue this story resides just before the incursions. We could argue this story resides before the incursions even started happening. We don't know the exact placement of this, or at least I haven't been able to find it. I mean, there's reading orders, and all the reading orders simply say this is the story before Secret Wars because the last page says on to Secret Wars 2015. Let's go check it out. But in terms of the events of the story, all indications seem to be that in Secret Wars issue number 0, where Captain America and Iron Man fought for the last time, that version of Iron Man, that version of Tony Stark is superior Iron Man, that he's still basically the bad guy. But again, it's just kind of the things that he says that leads us to believe that more so than a declaration of I am superior Iron Man and I'm fighting against Captain America now. But with that being said, guys, we're going to go ahead and bring this video to an end. If you guys are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.